afternoon. Thank you, Professor Haim Lapin, for the introduction, and for the organizers of this conference, especially, of course, Professor Ohayon, Shimon Ohayon, and all the organizers of this conference in Maryland and also at Bar-Ilan University. The Jews of Yemen constituted one of the oldest communities in the Jewish diaspora, living there since pre-Islamic period. Throughout the 100 years in Yemen, the Jews developed their culture that synthesized ancient Jewish values with new concepts that were constantly arriving from the Jewish world abroad, together with elements of the Muslim culture. Like the Muslims, the Jews were dispersed throughout the country and settled primarily in the tribal rural areas in hundreds of small settlements. Only about 15%, even less, lived in towns, mainly in the capital of Sana'a, and this is in difference from other Jewish communities certainly from late 19th century on, that were becoming an urban community almost totally. Just to let you know how Yemen is or looked like, and how the Jewish settlement was just brought some images just for at the beginning that would show you how different Yemen was, both in geographical and the settlement, and also from its history and the Jewish history in Yemen. Well, this is the physical map of Yemen. If you see Yemen at the lower top of the Arabian space, don't see? Oh. Okay, this is the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Is there. If you see Aden here, it's the port. Now it's one country, but the period that I'm talking about is Aden was a protectorate, a British protectorate, was outside the borders of the Yemen, which I'm talking about. It became united with Yemen only in 1990. Okay, so this is Yemen. If you see the Red Sea over there, and this is. Look a larger map in Yemen in the Middle East, you see how where it's situated. It's very strategic. It's very strategic point where Yemen is located at the Strait, Bab el-Mandab, very important to the ways to India, for example. When the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, it was very important location for Europe and the Middle East in general. It's some pictures that I'm showing you. This is a village, a Yemeni village. You see the terrain. The terrain is different from what we imagine. Highland, high mountains, villages on top of the mountains, and the farmers, which are tribal farmers, are cultivating the land in terraces. And this is, if you look at another one, and the Jews lived in these villages next to the Muslims. Few families in each village. We are talking about more than 1,200 Jewish settlements in Yemen, which are recorded. We have more than 1,200 Jewish Yemeni settlements. And this is another image. And you see here the terraces which were cultivated. And on top of the mountains are the buildings. Down there are the farmland. And this is an image of Sana'a, which is the capital, which is a little different, which was also by a small town by in 1950, it had 50,000 people. In 1970, 50,000 people. Since then it grew, today it's millions of people, it's different. But still it was the center of the government, of the life of the people. This is the old gate entrance to the capital. And this, I live here, this is an image of this unique architecture of Sana'a. Maybe I leave it here. I have other images, but I leave it here. Okay. Under the rule of Islam, and until the middle of the 20th century, the Jews were largely defined in according to Muslim law as Demise, that is, protected people. They were granted religious freedom and assurances of personal security and property in exchange for their acknowledgement of Muslim political and social supremacy, which was conveyed by the payment of the jizya, poll tax, and obedience to a collection of discriminatory restrictions. For example, Jews were required to wear distinguishing clothes, and their homes could not rise above Muslim houses. These rules were more strictly observed in Sana'a and its surroundings, and in a lesser extent in the tribal regions where the most of the Jews lived. The 19th century witnessed the growing interest of world powers in the Red Sea region. The British occupation of Aden in 1839, this is a very important port for them, became a very important port and a city of commerce and a important port city. And then the Ottoman conquest of central Yemen in 1872 and the Italian penetration to East Africa in the 1880s. The growing influence of world powers in the area, the opening of Yemen by the Ottomans to global economy and to the influx of industrial goods undermined the traditional infrastructure of the Jewish economy, which was based on the crafts. Consequently, Jews were being pushed from the crafts to retail trade and peddling. This is a process which began at the second half of the 19th century. This development ensued the beginning of a large-scale Jewish emigration from Yemen, which became a solution for economic distress. Although this trend is generally recognized as almost entirely directed to Palestine and Israel, its initial characteristics are evident in immigration to East Africa and to a lesser extent to Egypt and India. The remarkable immigration to Palestine began in 1881, some years after the Ottoman conquest of Yemen. This awakening was linked to the traditional and religious attachment of the Yemeni Jews to the Holy Land. The political change generated the new context of a large empire whose citizens could travel freely from one province to another within its borders. The facilitation of means of transportation and communication under the Ottomans turned now travel from Yemen to Palestine, which both were part of the same Ottoman Empire. It turned it a lot easier. The first groups of immigrants from Yemen to Palestine came from Sana'a in central Yemen and settled primarily in Jerusalem. Later on, Jews began to arrive also from other parts of Yemen. These newcomers made their homes in the agricultural communities, moshavot, that had been founded in Palestine. The letters Jews in Yemen received from their relatives in Palestine, encouraging them to come and join them, were an important factor in motivating them to immigrate. In any rate, by 1914, the eve of World War I, approximately 8% of the total number of the Jews of Yemen, about 5,000 people, had made their way to Palestine, a figure unmatched in any other community. Pertinent to note that immigration from Yemen to Palestine was unrelated to the Zionist organization or Zionist movement, its emissaries or institutions. Throughout the entire period of Jewish presence in Yemen, no local Zionist organizations were active within Yemen, and the Zionist movement had never had a permanent outposts there. Up to the establishment of the State of Israel, secular national ideas, as expressed by the Zionist movement, barely affected the Yemeni Jews at all. The following discussion will expound on the migration-related issues, mainly between two world wars, and will conclude with immigration to Israel following the establishment of the state. With the retreat of the Ottomans at the end of 1918, at the end of World War I, the Imami regime, headed by Imam Yahya, was restored in Yemen. Imam Yahya ruled the country until 1948 and then was succeeded by his son Imam Ahmad, who governed until the Republican Revolution of 1962. Jewish historiography maintains that the departure of the Jews almost totally depended on the policy of Yemeni authorities, and that the Imam's attitude toward Jewish immigration to Palestine was consistently hostile. This presentation points at two other factors that affected Jewish immigration after World War I, when Great Britain became the mandatory power in Palestine. Restrictions imposed by the British on Jewish immigration to Palestine, and secondly, the number of immigration certificates allocated by World Zionist Organization, WZO, to Yemeni Jews. First to Imam Yahya's policy toward Jewish immigration. In the collective memory of Yemeni Jews, Imam Yahya is perceived as a just and benevolent ruler. Many of their writings describe his reign as one of mercy and justice, during which the Jews enjoyed absolute protection and security of life and property. For months after his assassination in 1948, his tomb was visited by Jews who came to pray for him, mourn, and lament his death. Even his policy toward Jewish immigration did not undermine this image. In 1922, Imam Yahya, acting to comply with contemporary political trends in the Arab world, issued an edict that prohibited Jews from leaving Yemen. Yet, the statistics on immigration from Yemen to Palestine after publishing the ban on immigration, these statistics show that not only did the number of Jews who left Yemen not drop, but it steadily grew. Clearly, Jews were not entirely barred from leaving Yemen. In Sana'a, Jews would approach Imam Yahya personally and ask his permission to immigrate to Palestine on religious grounds or in order to be united with relatives. Imam Yahya acceded several of these requests. In practice, the ban on immigration was mainly enforced in areas under direct Imami rule, that is, in the regional towns and central Yemen, but not in the rural tribal regions where the majority of the Jews lived. The Yemeni tribes defied attempts by the central government to impose restrictions at variance from their long-standing practices and customary laws. Thusly, they did not limit or restrict the movement of Jews within and out their territories. Thus, Imam Yahya impeded Jewish immigration from the territories under his direct rule, but he did not invest much effort in preventing rural Jews from leaving the country. Important as it was, the Imami policy and the tribal sheikh's attitude toward the Jews were not the dominant factors that determined Yemeni Jewish immigration. The flow of immigrants toward the port of Aden was rather regulated primarily by information that reached Jews regarding the availability of immigration certificates to Palestine. And this depended upon the British, who governed both Palestine and the port of Aden, and more so upon the Jewish agency policy of allocation of certificates. Beginning in 1922, the British attempted to regulate Jewish immigration to Palestine by considering immigration in light of the country's economic situation and its ability to absorb newcomers, and thus issued certificates to immigrants whose future was economically viable. Applicants who did not have capital or the required vocational training, as were most of the Yemeni Jews, these were allocated only limited number of certificates under the category of workers. In 1929, the British assigned the Jewish Agency the responsibility for allocating immigration certificates in the category of workers. The Jewish Agency distributed these certificates according to requests by political parties represented in the Zionist organization. Since there was little organized Zionist activity in Muslim lands, and potential immigrants lacked the needed connections with political parties represented in the WZO, they were allocated only a small number of certificates. However, Yemeni Jews already in Palestine comprised a political pressure group that achieved that of the total number of certificates allocated to Muslim countries, Yemeni Jews received the largest number. After World War I, the number of Yemeni Jewish immigrants slowly but steadily increased. But in the
Take this opportunity to remind people to silence their cell phones.
But in the mid-1930s, with the diversion of certificates to German Jews, the numbers of Yemeni immigrants, the number declined until immigration ceased almost entirely in 1949, maybe the beginning of 1942. Throughout this period, many Jews who reached Aden waited there for years without proper accommodations or means of support until they were able to immigrate to Palestine. Toward the end of 1942, the fate of European Jews and the horrors of the Holocaust became well known. The Jewish Agency suggested that in order to increase the Jewish demographic presence in Palestine, unused immigration certificates be transferred to Jews from Muslim lands. This new situation augmented immigration from Yemen. News of available certificates inspired thousands of Jews to pour into the Aden Protectorate. In 1943, more Jews emigrated from Yemen than from any other country. Talking about 2,500. The British, unprepared for such a flood of people, closed the border in 1943. They were not ready for such a flood of people. Hundreds of Jews were trapped in the frontier settlements in both Yemeni and British protectorate and British territories. Some managed to slip into the town of Aden and its vicinity, and as a result, close to 85,000 souls were crowded there. In January 1944, the British attempted to confine as many as newcomers as possible in a supervised location, and close to 16,000 Jews were captured and put in confinement in an old military camp. At first, the camp was administered by the British, but soon it appealed to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, to take responsibility for the camp. Consequently, the camp was administered by the JDC, the Joint, in cooperation with the Jewish Agency. Between 1943 and 1944, more than 5,000 Yemeni Jews who reached Aden, the Aden Protectorate, received immigration certificates. So these were the certificates that still was issued to Palestine. Okay. Hundreds of Jews who expected to receive certificates continued to stream to Aden. However, as following World War II, priority for certificates were given to Holocaust survivors, and immigration of Yemeni Jews to Palestine was ceased altogether. In 1946, the strenuous situation in Aden resumed the joint activity, which ceased when it was believed that most of the Jews left for Palestine. The British assigned the joint a deserted military camp, which was known as Hashid or Geula. A number of Yemeni Jews who stayed in Aden and were found in a miserable medical condition were brought to the camp and given shelter and medical care. With no available immigration certificates, many Jews who waited in Aden considered returning to Yemen. The joint encouraged them to return. The Yemeni Imam announced that he will welcome them back, and the British offered to finance travel expenses. Between late 46 and the course of 1947, close to 1,500 Jews left Aden for Yemen. In addition, in 1946, when the Jewish Agency and the Joint concluded that certificates were not likely to reach Aden, the Jewish Agency sent a messenger, Haim, to inland Yemen to stop the Jews from coming. Nonetheless, during this time as well, some Jews returned to Yemen, other Jews continued to infiltrate the border into the British-controlled territory. During the British Mandate period, 15,500 Yemeni, this is close number, approximately 15,500 Yemeni Jews immigrated legally to Palestine. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 removed the main obstacle, that of the British opposition to Jewish immigration. Another major question remained: what would be the stand of the Yemeni authorities to Jewish immigration to Israel? This issue was resolved in May 1949 when Imam Ahmad issued a certificate allowing all the Jews who wished to do so to leave Yemen. The Imam did not demand from those living any form of tax or levy. He did not believe, he didn't assume that so many Jews would leave. And most of the Jews eventually left Lapin. And the mass departure of the Jews following Imam Ahmad's permit and their journey to Aden, the involvement of the State of Israel, and the management of the Geula or the Hashid transit camp, living conditions there, and the airlift to Israel are beyond the scope of this discussion. I can say that from December 1948 to the end of 1950, close to 50,000 people left Aden for Israel in an airlift known as On Eagle Wings. The whole operation was carried out by the Joint with the assistance of the Israeli government and the Jewish Agency. Thereafter, only a few thousand Jews remained in Yemen. Most of them departed in the course of the following years. Nowadays, there are about 40 Jews living in Yemen, and despite the current desperate situation there, they don't hurry to leave. They choose, as of yet, to stay in Yemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two questions. Rather do them at the end, but I feel like each of the papers is so